Good morning. I am Melinda Downing, the Environmental Justice Program Manager for the Department of Energy. But this morning, I'm pleased to welcome you on behalf of the National Environmental Justice Conference and Training Program. Today is the first in a series of environmental justice workshops that will be held leading up to our annual Joint Environmental Justice Conference scheduled for September of this year. This morning's workshop is titled Federal Title VI and Environmental Justice Priorities. This will be a panel discussion moderated by Ms. Daria Neal, whom I have the pleasure of introducing. Daria supervises a team of attorneys who work with the federal agencies to ensure consistent and effective enforcement of civil rights statute and executive orders that prohibit discrimination in federally conducted and assisted programs. Daria also serves as our Title VI training expert during our annual EJ conference. And I'm told that we have at least 700 people registered for today's conference. So I hope you enjoy the workshop and ask plenty of questions. And I thank you all for being here. And now we'll turn the mic over to Daria.
All right, thank you so much, Melinda. And I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning. This last year has been one of the most significant points in our recent history. We have seen a wave of violence directed at Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders and nationwide protests against racism and police brutality in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. All of this is occurring in the midst of a global pandemic that has disproportionately killed African Americans, Latinos, and Indigenous populations. And we know that these same communities have been bearing a disproportionate burden of environmental pollution for decades. Next slide, please. The connection between race and pollution is well established and beyond dispute. For example, a 2017 report from the NAACP and the Clean Air Task Force established that African Americans are 75% more likely than other Americans to live in fence-lined communities near facilities that produce hazardous waste. An EPA study published in 2018 examined the racial and economic makeup of communities around facilities emitting air pollution. It found that African Americans are exposed to 1.5 times as much air pollution, regardless of income. President Biden has issued numerous executive orders to date, many striking a common theme: the need to address racial inequities and the climate crisis. The whole of government approach of this administration mandates us to look holistically at these issues. The layers of inequity, pollution, lack of clean air, lack of health care, are not felt separately by real people. In our lived experience, these layers work together and can have devastating cumulative effects. The President's executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad created a new White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council and the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which are charged in part with making recommendations to revise the Executive Order 12898, the 1994 order that addresses environmental justice. During its public meeting last week, the Advisory Council, or commonly known as the WEJAC, made several recommendations, of which incorporating enforcement of civil rights laws in the EJ Executive Order was one of them. Additionally, the President's Executive Order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government has charged federal agencies to identify and address barriers to achieving racial equity in federal programs. Government-wide enforcement of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act will play a significant role in addressing these issues together. Next slide, please. Many of you may know that for the last 10 years at least, this conference has held sessions and trainings focused on Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and its role in addressing environmental justice issues. And you may know that Title VI prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin in programs and activities receiving federal financial assistance. Next slide. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of programs across the country receive federal financial assistance, and that assistance confers Title VI jurisdiction over all the operations of those programs. As a result, Title VI enforcement has the potential to affect every facet of American life: pollution, emergencies, the justice system, housing, public transportation, education, and more. Next slide. So the Department of Justice is responsible for coordinating the implementation and enforcement by executive agencies of Title VI and other non-discrimination statutes. Accordingly, DOJ is charged with ensuring consistent and effective implementation of Title VI across the federal family. While each federal agency extending federal financial assistance has primary responsibility for implementing Title VI with respect to its recipients, overall coordination in identifying legal and operational standards and ensuring consistent application rests with DOJ in the Civil Rights Division. It is through our work, and at times our own Title VI enforcement efforts, that we work with agencies on today's panel who have Title VI authority over federally funded programs and activities impacting the environment and human health. The division continues its leadership role on the Title VI committee of the Environmental Justice Interagency Working Group. Through that committee, we are working with our sister agencies to improve coordination of Title VI across the federal family. Additionally, the division, along with the Department of Justice's Environment and Natural Resources Division, are represented on the White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council. The Civil Rights Division also provides a range of resources to support federal civil rights enforcement. Our Title VI legal manual, recently posted again on our website, is an important resource for federal agencies. Next slide. And so today you will hear from representatives from the Environmental Protection Agency and the Departments of Transportation, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, and Homeland Security. Each will share with you current priorities of their civil rights programs. Then we will open it up for a question and answer period. So with that, I will pass it on to Lillian Dorca.
Thank you so much, Daria, and thank you for sponsoring this panel and for your leadership in bringing us all together. Most of us on this panel have been together a long time. We have been at this a long time. But I can truly say that the commitment that we are now experiencing, that this agency has made to civil rights and environmental justice, is unprecedented. And we are all certainly feeling that. At EPA, although we are in the midst of really planning comprehensively our strategic plan for the next 4 years, we thought it was very important early on to come out with a very strong statement of our civil rights commitment, because Administrator Regan has made it very clear, in fact, issued an email to all EPA employees expressing his commitment to environmental justice and to civil rights, and asking his leadership to take immediate steps and affirmative steps to incorporate environmental justice considerations into all EPA work. And he's very clearly made civil rights enforcement an EPA priority. And that's been communicated throughout all of our equity teams who are working to, in fact, ensure that we are incorporating and considering environmental justice in everything that we do. If you could show, I guess, the slide. Thank you so much. So I talked about making a statement early on about how we are strengthening civil rights enforcement. And while we work on this comprehensive strategic plan for the next 4 years, we have some overarching principles, 5 overarching principles that we think really focus our commitment moving forward to make sure that the promise of EPA's mission, the protection of human health and the environment, is a reality, not for some, but for all people in the United States. So first and foremost, and of course, all of this is taking into account many of the recommendations that have been submitted to us by you, by the listeners here today, by advocacy groups who have long been upset and concerned that not enough was being done for overburdened and disadvantaged communities. So firstly, we have made a very overt commitment to proactive civil rights activities, not just responding to complaints in a timely and effective manner, but proactively addressing affirmative compliance reviews, for example, and ensuring that those affirmative compliance reviews are in fact in environmentally overburdened and disadvantaged communities. So while we are building not just our strategic plan, but a comprehensive docket of those affirmative compliance reviews, we know that by the end of this year, we will in fact launch 1 or more affirmative compliance reviews. And we are looking at issues also that have been surfaced through your involvement, issues about, of course, the mortality and morbidity rates of minority communities, of Black and Latino communities with respect to COVID-19 and the pollutants, PM 2.5 and other air pollutants, and the convergence of that with morbidity and mortality rates. So we are looking at a lot of data relative to that so that we can identify some fertile areas possibly with respect to that issue. Another issue, for example, that we're considering is water infrastructure. We've heard that is a particularly acute issue in overburdened and disadvantaged communities of color. So we are looking at that, but we are hoping also to do more extensive outreach and to hear back about specific areas of focus for us in terms of our geographic selection of these communities for our compliance reviews. The second step, very concrete step that we're taking, is to ensure, in fact, the integration of civil rights obligations and programmatic actions across EPA. And as I said, at the very highest levels at EPA, it has been made very clear that not just environmental enforcement, but civil rights enforcement is an overarching priority that we are all looking at, and the entire of EPA to support us in those efforts. The integration of EJ principles into civil rights enforcement and the collaboration across the entire agency especially to incorporate the analyses of things like disproportionate impact and cumulative impacts in our decision making is critical. And so we are developing, one of the things that we're working on is policy guidance, of course, to expand our policy guidance. And by the end of this year, we're hoping to release some very comprehensive and very clear policy guidance with respect to non-discrimination program requirements for agencies that receive money from EPA. We can no longer leave it up to chance that folks are going to have in place the non-discrimination programs that the regulations require. So we're going to make those commitments very clear, and we're going to be holding folks accountable, and we're going to strengthen our pre-award review process to ensure that. We hope to release some guidance on that, some comprehensive guidance on that by the end of this year, and then do some additional strengthening of pre-award reviews in fiscal year 2022. And of course, the other piece of guidance that we are working on and we're hoping to release in 2022 is to add and to strengthen the guidance that we already have out there about the Title VI standards of review and legal standards to make sure that we are using all of the tools in our arsenal, that we are fully implementing and using disparate impact analyses as well as different treatment analyses, and that we're considering appropriately from a civil rights perspective cumulative impacts that so plague overburdened and disadvantaged communities. We absolutely know that and value that. We are also very, very committed to coordinating and communicating and engaging more effectively with disadvantaged and overburdened communities. And we hope to do increased outreach, not just in terms of our proactive activities and our affirmative compliance reviews, but even within the context of our complaint investigations. We know that there are many who are disappointed that they are not more involved in that process, especially during the time in that process when we engage with our recipients in informal resolution. And we are thinking of ways to bring complainants and involve them, complainants and communities, more effectively in that negotiation and resolution process. And finally, and of course, you know, this is sort of the culmination and the epitome of this, the leadership on interagency collaboration across the federal government to enforce Federal Civil Rights Act. This is the first step. And we realize that there are challenges here. This is the beginning, right? The beginning of hopefully a very productive story. Our commitment and our leadership has never before been called so acutely into action as now. And now is the time for all of us. And I know that my fellow panelists, you know, they live this stuff. Most of whom have been at this work for many years. And we don't take this lightly. We don't take this opportunity that's being offered to us right now lightly. And we are very much committed to making it happen and to really leaving some very specific and impactful actions that are not just fleeting and are not just part of this administration, but that are structural and they are in place and that will continue to benefit overburdened and disadvantaged communities. I will turn it over back to Daria, or if there are questions now. Daria, I don't know if you want to continue with the panel.
Yep, we'll just continue on. Thank you, Lillian.
Thank you.
So I will now turn it to Yvette Rivera from Department of Transportation.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for having us. I want to underscore what Lily talked about, and I want to give a big shout out to Daria and to our colleagues, because we have been the ones who in the last several years have been making sure that critical functions still continue. So, you know, just an important to do that shout out. So I serve as an Associate Director of the Departmental Office of Civil Rights at DOT. And before I continue, I want to bring warm greetings from our Director, Irene Marian, and of course, Secretary Pete Buttigieg. So what is happening under the new administration? We are being held accountable, just as Lily explained, to activate a new renewed focus on civil rights to address racial inequities. That mission is not easy, but it is certainly refreshing to be working with leaders like Director Marian and Secretary Buttigieg. And as you know, he champions these issues publicly many times. As the Departmental Office of Civil Rights, as part of the Departmental Office of Civil Rights, we are responsible for many functions and programs that you are likely familiar with at the state level. To those new to the conference and to DOT and to this work, DOT is composed of the Office of the Secretary and several transportation components referred to as operating administrations. Some are familiar to you. Federal Highway Administration, Federal Aviation Administration, Federal Transit Administration. We are a big acronym agency. It's funny when you start here, all you hear is, what is that? What is that? And that was how it was for Director Marion when she arrived on January 21. Generally, the office is responsible for policy and oversight of transportation programs. That's the office of the secretary, where we sit, and we help to administer policies that are going to be carried out by our operating administrations, the FAA, the FTA. As our head, Director Marion is the designated principal advisor to the secretaries on all matters relating to civil rights in the Department of Transportation. And my role is to support her and our deputy director, Barbara Dougherty, in providing leadership, policy, guidance, oversight, and technical assistance to our operating administrations in implementing DOT's civil rights responsibilities. And each operating administration has its own Office of Civil Rights to ensure civil rights compliance for their respective organizations and programs. My particular focus is Title VI, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and the ADA, the Section 2 of the ADA. Also, I am a member of DOT's EJ working group, and I work closely with the group. While our office, the Departmental Office of Civil Rights, was significantly under-resourced and faced significant challenges, as I mentioned before, we worked to preserve critical civil rights functions. And now, as we find ourselves invigorated and doing the work to advance equity and civil rights. So, what have we done since January 21st? Well, I'm proud to say that the Secretary signed updated civil rights policy statements and signed the first ever equity policy statement, which seeks to ensure that we're embedding civil rights in everything we do. As Lily said, it is happening at EPA. We also are in the process of reactivating our 2016 Title VI order, which calls for big proactive compliance with Title VI, stakeholder engagement, pre-awards review, and many more. So I'm hoping that in our coming meetings, I can talk about that in greater detail. We've partnered with our Office of General Counsel to establish our authority as a civil rights office at DOT, and we are moving forward with filling vacancies to build our team to carry out all our civil rights programs and responsibilities, provide technical assistance, and accomplish a meaningful stakeholder engagement. As you know, and as Lily mentioned, President Biden signed important executive orders, and our office is co-leading or leading a lot of the work that is required under those executive orders. With this whole of government approach on equity, we've been asked to kickstart the work on a fairly aggressive timeline. We have Gantt charts and everything going on to accomplish this. And the one big important action was to establish an internal equity task force that is focused on data and assessment, workforce equity, economic justice, mobility justice, stakeholder engagement, and technology and innovation and budget. And this task force, this equity task force, includes leadership from all DOT operating administrations and career staff in key positions across the organization. So I want to assure you that civil rights ultimately is the foundation of any equity agenda. Equity relies on our ability to ensure proactive civil rights compliance, and equity requires that we deepen our community partnerships. We are actively engaging with our internal stakeholders to embed an equity lens to better serve historically underserved communities. And we're facilitating proactive programs that eventually will result in less complaints and investigations downstream. The ultimate goal is to apply a strong lens and align resources to lead better transportation decisions throughout the country and to lessen disparate impacts over time. This shift, I know, is, cannot be done in civil rights departments alone, or offices, or divisions, or in isolation. And as Lily mentioned, and as Daria talked about, we have this whole government approach to advance racial equity, and clarifying that it's the job of every team, every employee, every recipient of federal funds to address the inequities in our transportation systems and within our workforce. So what's the outlook? What are we looking to do? We want to fully use our civil rights authorities to ensure equity and access in transportation, ensure that we have an intersectional lens that leads with race and equity and access, and strengthens our focus on disability, gender identity, sexual orientation, and other historically underserved communities. And offer, as refreshed civil rights guidance, tools, and training and technical assistance for DOT operating administrations and recipients of federal funds, and to facilitate more opportunities for community members to provide feedback, engage in planning for the future of America's transportation infrastructure. We hope that as we look back to this period, we feel we've done all we can to chart a new path forward for our country, and that we have empowered a new set of partners in civil rights and equity, and that we've inspired new generations to work in the transportation sector. So I hope you're ready to engage, because we need your wisdom, your ideas, your feedback. And we're expecting to do, as we mentioned, as I mentioned earlier, really clarify and implement a meaningful stakeholder engagement program, and so that we have your feedback and again your ideas. So again, thank you to the National Environmental Justice Conference for having us here, and I look forward to our conversation later on. And I thank you again, Daria, for keeping us going. Thanks.
Thank you, Yvette. And now we'll hear from Pamela Barron from Health and Human Services.
Daria, thank you so much for bringing us all together, and thank you, National Environmental Justice Conference, for having us. I would like to just tie into what Daria has said, and Lillian and Yvette, and I know Amy will also be saying some wise things about this. First of all, just to say thank you for having us. The very fact that we're here tells you that we are open for business. We're grateful for this. I'd like to send greetings from our acting director from the Office for Civil Rights, Dr. Robin Sufrabosi, who can't be here today because she's speaking at another panel, and also from our secretary, Javier Becerra. Everyone fully supports this renewed engagement in environmental justice. We're very grateful for this opportunity to take a moment and think back about what we've learned during this pandemic. The pandemic has laid bare the connection between environmental and health disparities experienced by communities of color. We recognize that health impacts of persistent pollution, lack of access to basic services, including water infrastructure, and consistent quality health care are civil rights issues. The President's new climate change executive order recognizes that environmental justice isn't just about pollution, but it's about the underinvestment in housing and transportation and water and wastewater infrastructure and healthcare. As our acting director has said, HHS OCR is open for business. We want to work on the Title VI complaints, and I'm here in part to listen to those of you from the communities who want to help us understand how best to direct our enforcement efforts. We're extremely grateful for our partners represented here today, Department of Justice, Transportation, EPA. There are so many partnerships that we're about to avail ourselves of, because now, being open for business, we can provide a little bit more service in this arena as more things are being pointed out to us. Who's helping us? The advocates out in the community. Advocates bring forth complaints, some of them with so much helpful data, information. They clarify the issues for us. So we're just very grateful for our partners in the advocacy community who bring complaints to us and make us aware of things. Of course, we're always out investigating. We read the newspapers. We know where there are problem spots. But this incredible assistance from the advocates has been invaluable. So what do we do in our Title VI program? Well, Title VI is one of the many statutes that we enforce. We're Health and Human Services. We have a very broad array of activities. We actually protect against discrimination in race, color, national origin, including language access, sex, age, disability. It's a broad array of statutes. Title VI is one of our statutes, but we also have 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, Title IX, the Age Discrimination Act, Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act, Title II of the ADA. So a very broad array of programs, and we're so pleased that we are looking at them through an equity lens. And this is going to be very helpful. So how do we do something useful in this time of a resurgence of interest in environmental justice? Well, we reach out to our partners. And so please feel free when you file complaints to file them with multiple agencies so that we can work together and harness our strengths. What has COVID done for us in this arena? Well, COVID has taught us that we can speak with a big voice. We, for example, OCR put forth a guidance document in the midst of the pandemic to ensure that covered entities knew that civil rights protections continue during a pandemic, and race, color, and national origin discrimination will not be tolerated during the pandemic. This can come down to, where do you cite your testing sites? Where do you cite vaccine sites? So there are health implications for many of these decisions that are being made, and there are health implications, obviously, for the environmental justice piece. So we're just very grateful to be a part of it. We will be working with our partners in the interagency working group. And again, I'd like to just thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'm very happy to listen and hear what you can help us know as we join hands to fight in this. So thank you again, Daria, and thank you, National Environmental Justice Conference. And at this point, I turn it back to Daria.
Thank you. And now we'll hear from Lynn Grasso from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We have you muted.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. And like my other, can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Very good. Thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. Of course, like my colleagues, I bring greetings from Secretary Fudge, and also am here in place of Acting Assistant Secretary Janine Warden, who oversees our Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. I'm the Director of Enforcement in the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity, and I think that there's an important reason that I'm here today representing the department. We recently celebrated the 3rd anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. And even though environmental justice is a component of community development, it's important for us to remember, and I think as we're talking today, it is a fair housing issue. Racial segregation in housing and the inequities that bear on predominantly Black and Brown communities are codified in local land use and zoning laws, and they are built into the way state and federal governments have done business. We know this. And that kind of business is business that burdens like manufacturing, highways, sewage processing, but it's also built into the way we do business, and that business is business that brings opportunity, like schools, clean water, recreation, and storm protection. And HUD plays a very important role in how we ensure that our state and local governments partner with us in equitable ways. We know that neighborhoods where Black families and ethnic minorities live, because these segregation patterns exist, too often bear the burden of and remain the targets for infrastructure that pollutes and depletes quality of life. Too often, however, neighborhoods where Black families and ethnic minorities live are overlooked and denied infrastructure that builds opportunity, that promotes health, and improves our quality of life. So as we all know, and the reason we're here, this is systemic institutionalized racism, of course. It's a legacy of discriminatory action and discriminatory inaction at our federal, state, and local levels. And HUD, like local governments and state governments and other federal agencies, has been part of the problem historically. And we recognize that we hold and must better use its authority, our authority, to leverage change in the area of environmental justice. One of the ways that we have done this, and we have done this on short order under this administration, is to, as you've heard today, start to look at how every part of HUD can end housing discrimination, can redress ongoing harms of racist housing policies, remove barriers that restrict access to housing and neighborhood choice, and secure equal access and to housing opportunity for all. We have to look inside of our department in accordance with President Biden's executive order to eliminate racial bias and other forms of discrimination in every stage of home buying and renting. We have to lift barriers that restrict housing and neighborhood choice. And we have to ensure the sufficient availability of accessible, affordable housing. We are looking at ways at every intersection in the department to ensure that we are affirmatively furthering fair housing, including ensuring environmental justice in a way that we have not done this before. Part of this internal equity assessment that is going to touch our offices of community planning and development, our offices of single family housing, our office even of fair housing, our office of public housing, is we have to make sure that policies that have been in place for decades are assessed and changed to ensure that our services are delivered with equity and equal opportunity. And part of this internal equity assessment is also to ensure, and this is happening across federal government, that our civil rights arms are adequately resourced and operationalized to fully enforce all the legal authorities we can to ensure civil rights and equity in the services that we deliver. We must tackle the lack of affordability of housing and ensure that affordable housing is developed and located in areas that afford its residents access to vital community assets, including good schools, good paying jobs, and reliable transportation. In addition to the President's executive order that charged all federal agencies to do an internal equity assessment, the President has specifically ordered the Department of Housing and Urban Development to determine ways that we can redress our nation's and the federal government's history of discriminatory housing practices and policies. And we have taken two very important steps very early on since this executive order to further this charge. On April 12th, we proposed, as many of you know, we proposed two rules that are a very high priority under this administration. We have seen a dismantling over the last several years of HUD's efforts to affirmatively further fair housing and to fully enforce the Fair Housing Act in a manner that addresses discriminatory effects. So we have submitted to OMB the two documents that are the beginning of rulemaking in these areas. Because we have engaged in this rulemaking process, I can't speak to these in great detail. It is available. This information that we have submitted this to OMB is available on OMB's website. I can't tell you much about the rules, but I think the title of the rules tells you everything you need to know. We have submitted to OMB a proposed rule entitled the Reinstatement of HUD's Discriminatory Effects Standard. And on the same day, we have also submitted an interim final rule to affirmatively further fair housing and restoring the statutory definitions and certifications under the AFFH rule. The department has also recognizes that it plays an important role in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic and the hardships that the entire nation has seen around this, but also the way that the pandemic has highlighted and magnified many truths we need to recognize, including truths that relate directly to fair housing and the enormous amount of work that still needs to be done. We know that that Black individuals are almost 3 times more likely than their white counterparts to be hospitalized, and nearly 2.5 times more likely to die from COVID. We see the same inequities in Hispanic communities and American Indian and Native communities. And we see particularly high rates of infection and death among people with disabilities, particularly intellectual and developmental disabilities, where those individuals are more likely to have to live in congregate settings. What we know now is that we are on the precipice of an enormous housing strain. As eviction moratoriums come to a close, we know that these inequities are going to be amplified, and we are going to see these inequities in the housing market, in a strained housing market. And so we are preparing to make sure that our fair housing services are fully available to people who will see discrimination in this area as our housing market is increasingly strained. We are also working with our federal partners to ensure that vaccines come to neighborhoods and come to public housing projects where we believe people will be less likely to avail themselves for a variety of systemic reasons to access healthcare, to access vaccines. We are very, very excited to try and encourage and make it as easy as we can with our federal partners to ensure that communities of color have access to vaccines and feel the confidence to avail themselves of vaccines. And we think HUD plays an important role in that way. We recognize finally that that environmental justice is it intersects with, as I mentioned, so many of our housing resources. HUD administers legacy block grant programs such as the Community Development Block Grant Program, but also significant, enormous disaster recovery funds. And these funds support at a very large scale the development of disaster mitigation infrastructure. And so we understand that the action plans that state and local governments submit to us, the mitigation plans they submit to us, and the services that they carry out, the infrastructure development that they carry out, has to be carried out in a way that serves communities, particularly communities that have been overlooked and disregarded historically in this area. So my office will be working very closely with my HUD program partners to better leverage our resources to serve communities in this way. One of the very important parts of these block grants also is community participation. We may talk a little more about community participation later. Some of my colleagues have mentioned how important it is to hear from stakeholders, but not just at the federal level. I have to encourage stakeholders to avail themselves of opportunities for public participation that is required as a part of accepting federal funds in these areas. It's so important that advocates, community representatives speak up and speak loudly about ways that HUD funds can be better used to serve their communities. And I guess finally, some of my colleagues have mentioned work that their agencies have done to expand protections in the area of sexual orientation and gender identity. And we are really proud at HUD that we were the first agency to come out in response to the President's executive order to prevent and combat discrimination, to determine that the Fair Housing Act, in accordance with the Supreme Court's Bostock decision, would be enforced to include discrimination on the basis of sex because of gender identity and sexual orientation. We are not only enforcing the Fair Housing Act in this manner, but we are also ensuring that those state and local governments that coordinate with us and do fair housing work under a cooperative agreement with us also apply the law in the same manner. So we're in the process of working with our federal partners to ensure that in every way, these protections under the Fair Housing Act are fully enforced. I'm very pleased to be here. Very pleased to, I think that the leadership at HUD is very excited to have a more prominent role in the area of environmental justice. We recognize the importance of HUD services, not just directly our federal services, but the way that our funded partners carry out these services has an enormous impact in the area of environmental justice. So I look forward to hearing from stakeholders as we move through and begin to stage up this work in a more robust way. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. I'll give it back to you, Daria.
Thanks, Lynn. And we will hear from Amy Vance from the Department of Homeland Security.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Amy Vance, and I am the Title VI Coordinator in the Department of Homeland Security, Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. And I just wanted to, just say how excited and thankful I am to be here this morning with all of my fellow panelists, because I think, one thing I'm hearing is that, right, the time is now. I mean, I think we can all agree that this is the moment, right, that we need to seize this moment in terms of advancing the principles and integrating the principles of environmental justice into all of our work and really taking a good look at our programs, policies, and activities of not only our own departments, but those of our federally assisted recipients to really expand and embed the work of environmental justice. And so I just want to talk a little bit about the work of our office in DHS and some of the exciting things that we have coming, that have been in the works for the past few months and that are sort of coming to fruition this year. So just a little bit about our office. The Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, or CRCL, it's the headquarters civil rights office in the Department of Homeland Security. And one of our functions is to implement a recipient civil rights program. And that's to ensure non-discrimination in the department's federally assisted programs and activities. Our office also co-leads the department's environmental justice program with the DHS Office of the Chief Readiness Support Officer. So a little bit about that program. The DHS EJ program, we examine both, of course, environmental justice consideration in the department's own programs, policies, and activities, through a NEPA lens, but we also look at the activities of our federally assisted recipients. And that's really where the work of my office comes into focus. So, we're really focused on ensuring that department recipients that carry out programs and activities that affect human health and the environment do not discriminate on the basis of race, color, national origin, violation of Title VI, as well as sex, age, disability, and religion. And just to give some context, DHS provides grants and other types of federal financial assistance to a wide array of recipients. So at any given time, we might be funding upwards of 3,000 non-federal entities. These can include state, local, tribal, territorial government agencies, including Homeland Security agencies and emergency management agencies. We also fund many fire departments, port and transit authorities, law enforcement agencies, colleges and universities, nonprofit organizations that provide direct services, and even state fish and wildlife agencies. So we have a very broad spanning mission, and we share many recipients and programs in common with other federal agencies. So I think that's just an important point because I think it speaks towards the need for interagency coordination to really leverage our collective enforcement capacity. So environmental justice considerations, of course, may arise in many DHS recipient programs that affect human health and the environment. One example I wanted to point out is our chemical stockpile emergency preparedness program. Our office actually conducted a compliance review of this program a few years ago. This program provides federal financial assistance to support states in carrying out emergency preparedness activities in communities where a chemical stockpile is located. Another, of course, very apparent example, which my other panelists have talked about, is vaccine distribution activities that are supported with federal financial assistance from DHS and other agencies. So FEMA actually leads the COVID-19 equity work for DHS, and they actually established a civil rights advisory group as part of the agency's commitment to the vaccination mission. So CRCL participates in this group as well as other federal agencies who are here today. And the group created a civil rights checklist to provide to states, territories, and tribal governments with a list of civil rights considerations and resources to ensure equitable vaccine access. So that's just sort of one example of one way that we're trying to sort of advance the principles of environmental justice and racial equity in our federally assisted work. So, it's clear, I mean, DHS funds programs that affect human health and the environment, and we have a responsibility to ensure non-discrimination in these programs. So as part of our overall recipient civil rights compliance program that I mentioned a little bit, we're currently expanding our capacity in a number of areas in this program. So that includes conducting in-depth compliance reviews, complaint investigations, training and technical assistance to our recipients, and data collection. And I did just want to, for a moment, expand on that data collection piece. So recently we've implemented a new requirement for DHS recipients to provide data on their civil rights complaints that are filed against them, as well as copies of their civil rights policies and procedures at the time of award. So our office, as well as our partners in FEMA, review this information from each recipient, and we provide detailed feedback to the recipient to address gaps and insufficiencies in their civil rights programs. So this requirement, it's called the Civil Rights Evaluation Tool. Other federal agencies have similar tools in place, and it is available on our website if anyone's interested in taking a look. And then I also just wanted to mention sort of two really sort of exciting resources that are coming out now that will really focus and guide the department's environmental justice work, including at the intersection of Title VI. So the first is actually the revised DHS Environmental Justice Strategy. That was actually just finalized a few days ago. It was signed by our secretary, and it will be issued very soon. And the strategy reflects really the department's renewed commitment to upholding the principles of environmental justice. But at the same time, it establishes new goals and objectives to support resilient communities. So their first strategy was issued in 2012, so it definitely needed updating, and we've incorporated the principles and considerations in President Biden's executive orders on environmental justice, as well as racial equity. So there's 5 overarching goals in this strategy that will really guide the department over the next 5 years. And just briefly, those are to expand department-wide awareness of environmental justice considerations that might result from its programs, policies, and activities. We're also going to focus on furthering the integration of environmental justice principles into DHS lines of business. And specifically, we'll be focusing on mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. 3, strengthening outreach to communities and stakeholders through public engagement. And I think that's something all of my panelists here have talked about, community engagement, whether it's on the department's own programs or activities or those of our federally assisted recipients, is really key to an effective enforcement program. 4, expanding collaboration and knowledge sharing with our interagency partners so that we can more efficiently focus our resources and technical assistance. And as I mentioned, DHS shares so many recipients in common with other agencies, and we have so many missions that overlap, with programs and other agencies. So it's really critically important that we're able to sort of leverage that collective enforcement and sort of knowledge capacity in other agencies to really tackle environmental justice communities or environmental justice issues at the community level. And the 5th goal is really to integrate environmental justice principles into department climate change initiatives. And climate change really has been a big focus as of late. And that goal is a great segue into the 2nd guiding resource document that I wanted to mention, which is the DHS Climate Action Plan. That's actually in the process of being finalized now. And the action plan lays out a number of priority action areas, one of which is environmental justice and racial equity. And through the plan, DHS recognizes that environmental justice is fundamentally affected by climate change. And the department must take action to integrate the principles and requirements of environmental justice and racial equity into climate change initiatives. At the same time, we need to consider what the effects of our actions are on communities that are at a greater risk of adverse effects due to climate change. So I won't get into all the specifics because this plan is in the process of being finalized now, but we are considering taking very specific actions to promote literacy on climate change and racial equity across the department and in our federally assisted programs, and to review our policies and procedures to ensure the consideration of these principles. So we're really excited about some of these priorities that we're working on now. All this information, of course, will be available on our website, and we're really excited to start engaging more with communities on these specific priority areas. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy, and thank you everyone for your remarks. I think we can see that we've been doing a lot in the last 15, 20 days of this new administration, and a lot has been asked of our agencies by this administration, and we all stand ready to respond and to address racial inequities, to address the climate crisis, and to do better, frankly, in the area of environmental justice. We have quite a few questions that I want to try to get to as many as possible. There are a few comments that I'll try and summarize. First, I think I'll probably combine the first 2 questions that have popped up. One on how equity can be distributed to communities that are so far behind when it comes to equity. What is the plan for leveling the playing field? And many communities are asking for organizations to work with them, not for them, and not only seek feedback from them. How are our agencies shifting our community engagement and planning accordingly? And so perhaps the panel can touch on a few of the points that you've raised separately. What immediately comes to mind is the increased work around enforcement, our Title VI enforcement work, whether it's to responding to complaints that we receive from the public. I think, Pam, you had noted that being a way for communities to bring issues to agencies' awareness, but also our own efforts at doing affirmative compliance reviews. Lily, you had mentioned that, and I believe, Amy, you had it as well. So maybe if you all could speak a little more to those, recognizing that there's a long way to go, but I think that our affirmative efforts are such that we are looking to address past inequities, current inequities, frankly, and do what we can to eliminate existing disparities. So, anyone wants to weigh in?
Sure, I absolutely.
First, go ahead. Go ahead.
Fantastic. So absolutely, I think part of stepping up, part of the department, part of HUD stepping up here is really flexing its Title VI muscle. And we do our compliance work and we do our fair housing work in a variety of ways, and it absolutely needs to be more than just listening to stakeholders. That's an important part of directing our priorities, I think, but we do our compliance work in a responsive way that you can, leverage our investigative and enforcement resources in response to complaints that are brought to us, complaints under the Fair Housing Act, under Title VI, even under Section 504, and we have other authorities that we enforce. So we can be responsive to matters that are individually brought to us or organizationally brought to us. But as you know, Daria, it's also about making sure that we are resourced and operational to do that affirmative compliance work where we go places where we know there are problems and exert our authorities. We can do periodic compliance reviews on recipients. We can also do front-end reviews. And front-end reviews, I think, are an area where the department, HUD, needs to look much more closely at our work. We really need to leverage the equity work we can do, doing front-end reviews to look at where are our housing programs, our housing investments going? What are our recipients? Where are our recipients investing federal resources? What communities perhaps are not getting the services they need? These are, I mentioned action plans, I mentioned mitigation plans, really looking closely at how our recipients operationalize the distribution of our funds. So there are a lot of aspects of our compliance work, and I think there's a lot that needs to be done here, and I feel a great deal of confidence that our current leadership is very supportive of us flexing the Title VI muscle this way.
And if I could jump in, this is Yvette Rivera. The idea, what Lynn is talking about and everyone else, is that we will look to see how that input was used. So it's not just check the box. I did community engagement and we received 1,000 comments, but what did you do with the comments? Otherwise, there's no meaningful community engagement, and I think that's what's required. It's a common sense, proactive compliance program to make sure that those considerations were part of the decision making, and if not, why not?
That's right, Yvette. And I think I would add too that we need to make sure that that in our organizations there's a natural tension, right? This natural tension between an internal civil rights arm and the funding parts of our agencies. There's a natural tension, and I think more often now that tension needs to fall in the favor of our civil rights organization, our civil rights part of our agencies.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with that more. And in addition to that, I think we have to find a way to institutionalize these practices, right? To keep it from being a once and done outreach thing, check the box, as Yvette mentioned, and more so something that we do as a matter of standard practice, right? Outreach and involvement, like real meaningful involvement. There's involvement and then there's meaningful involvement. And how do we gauge whether we are in fact having an impact on communities based on the work that we do? Not just the affirmative compliance reviews, which are, big splash items, but the day-to-day complaint investigations, and that we really and truly have some impact. We got to think about that, and we've got to make sure that we embed that in our case resolution manuals, and make sure that we do that as a matter of practice.
Yeah, I just wanted to agree and echo what the other panelists are speaking about in terms of engaging with the community. I mean, that's definitely something that we have thought about really, institutionalizing in our preventative compliance review, and our, that we could, carry out with our recipients. I mean, really, I think it is a really critical part of an effective compliance review program. But also kind of what Lillian was saying, right? Thinking beyond compliance reviews and just thinking in our day-to-day work, carrying out, our recipient compliance program. So, when we are conducting training and technical assistance with our recipients, to increase their understanding of what their obligations are and helping them understand how to operationalize those requirements. Are there opportunities where we can engage the public in that technical assistance and training that we're providing to recipients? That I think that might actually help to make the connection for many recipients on the significance of operationalizing these requirements. So I think that there's just a lot of ways to think about how engaging with communities on identifying cumulative historical impacts in a recipient compliance program is really critical. I just think it's something that we definitely want to give more consideration to over the next year.
Right, and I would say, just in case this might be, the moment during this discussion where we focus on stakeholder engagement and move on to other things, that we have to make sure that our recipients are doing affirmative marketing and affirmative outreach to reach communities, that they're adhering to requirements related to limited English proficiency, that they're ensuring that the opportunities for stakeholder engagement themselves don't exclude the most impacted communities. And that's such an essential part. It's just like we've said, then checking a box, it's doing it in a meaningful way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'd like to build on that, because I think you're so right. Not only do we want the recipients to be very clear about their obligations, but I really like the empowerment of the community too. Back in the day when I was a fair housing attorney, a long time ago, individuals would take a look at the fair housing notice in their rental office and call the Civil Rights Division and file a complaint, or file a complaint with HUD. And we would go in and look at the properties and find out that, hey, they're a low-income housing tax credit property. They have agreed that they're going to abide by all federal civil rights laws. And in that moment, our enforcement had a great deal of meaning to the people who were managing those properties and the people who had built those properties. And in that moment, we could see the citizens exercising power. They knew to make a complaint. The complaint got results, and it was really very impressive. So there's a lot of power in the assurances, the covered entities who agree they're going to abide by all federal civil rights laws. That's a thing of great power. So I'm really excited that not only are we letting the recipients know, but we're letting citizens know. We're doing a better job. We're talking to stakeholders at this moment. We're inviting advocacy groups to come alive. And we as agencies are joining hands to come alive and leverage our power together. I just think it's very exciting. Everything that HUD has done, everything that all these other agencies have done to take leadership We're very proud at HHS that we are also on board. It's just a very exciting time to get something done, as you've said. And Daria, again, we're just grateful that you're bringing us together, because together we can leverage so much. So thank you.
No, thank you, Pam. And you made a point about assurance documents that recipients sign, and I think it's worth reiterating that for folks who are participating today, that recipients of federal financial assistance must sign an assurance document that says they will comply with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, as well as other federal civil rights non-discrimination laws. And in doing so, that they're recognizing that responsibility, that they must be in compliance. And so there should be an awareness of what those responsibilities are. And if they are unclear, that our agencies have a vast amount of resources to help ensure that they act in compliance with the law. Several points I see in the following questions raised concerns around engagement, community engagement with local officials who may act in retaliation against residents who are exercising their right to complain about inequity in their community. I'd like to be clear too that Title VI of the Civil Rights Act includes a prohibition of retaliation in federal programs and activities that receive federal funds. That's intentional discrimination, and we have the authority to address retaliatory conduct. And I know that a couple of you all on the panel have addressed this issue with some of your matters, and I wonder if you'd be able to speak briefly about that experience.
I'll jump in, Daria, because I agree with you. It's not uncommon when you're dealing even with a state agency to have that element creep into the investigation, and not just retaliation, but intimidation, which is also prohibited.
Yes.
And I do think that it's a slightly different matter, right? We can't always show that there's a retaliatory action that has happened, but the intimidatory, action sometimes is very clear, especially when there are communities of complainants who have filed other internal, from the perspective of EPA, they've filed environmental complaints and are feeling a sense of intimidation or retaliation, and not even from the recipient, but from the third party, maybe from the facility itself. So we really have to be very vigilant to make sure that we keep that in check, and that we make it very clear from the very beginning, from the moment that we acknowledge receipt of a complaint, that we are not going to permit retaliation or intimidation of not just complainants, but any witness. And we need to follow that with very swift action.
Absolutely. And the Fair Housing Act has the same protections. It prohibits retaliation, intimidation, coercion against anyone who exercises their fair housing rights, against people who help others exercise their fair housing rights, whether it be advocating or filing a complaint. It's a very, very broad protection. And we get a fair number of complaints in that area, and would absolutely enforce those provisions in the area of environmental justice. The other thing I would add to touch on assurances and certifications, Daria, the Department of Justice is a very effective partner in ensuring that those certifications and assurances are not false. Communities that submit those certifications and assurances and do so in a way that is not meaningful and true risk being subjected to issues around false claims. And I know that there are stakeholders on this call right now who are very familiar with having to raise those issues against recipients of federal financial assistance that do not, or potentially have not, provided truthful claims, truthful assurances, and meaningful certifications.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to jump in and say, with proactive compliance, affirmatively ensuring compliance with our civil rights laws. We hope to shift that burden so that if you're in a community and you feel insecure about your housing, income, retaliation, you're not likely to come forward with a complaint and just deal with whatever that adverse action that you're experiencing. So, we really want to be held accountable for that part, that we are, as we talked about today, making sure at the front end that we are going beyond, check the box compliance processes and really deeply looking at, and testing what is being told to us about compliance by a recipient. So I just wanted to add that. And yes, like everyone else, we do have protections against retaliation, but we really want to, we understand reality. It's hard to come forward, even in the best of circumstances, because either something in your family or something in your community, you just want to avoid that. And it's a contractual agreement that jurisdictions make in taking these funds. They don't have to take them, but if they do, they do so with that agreement, and we need to certify that they're carrying out that promise.
I just also wanted to mention that DHS, part of our recipient compliance program, one of our emphasis is on holding recipients accountable for making sure that they are notifying the public about their rights under Title VI, as well as other civil rights statutes, and their right to file a complaint. That's something that is a big focus of our program, is to make sure that those recipients are engaging with the public, and in particular, including messaging about the prohibition against retaliation. So that's something that we look for when we're doing our sort of preventative compliance reviews of recipients, or we're going out conducting on-sites. That is something in particular that we are looking for as sort of a first step to promoting those sorts of principles and expanding the public's ability to then hold the recipients accountable as well. So, we're kind of coming at it from a few different angles, but that is something that we have been thinking about and are really now focusing on in our compliance work.
Before I move on to the next question, if I can ask our producer, technical person, if they can place the slide with all of our presenters' information on the screen. I think there was a request for that, so folks know all the agencies that are represented. That would be great. Thank you. Yep, that's a perfect slide. And I noticed that there were a couple of hands raised, and I'm not exactly sure how we're supposed to handle that. So if there's an ability to send your question through the Q&A feature or the chat feature, if you can try and do that, that would be great. We want to try and get to as many folks as we can. Okay, so we have a question around filing when there's a complaint that involves multiple agencies, federal agencies. So Amy, earlier, I think in your presentation and kind of alluded to in my opening remarks, is that there are a lot of recipients of federal financial assistance who get assistance from multiple agencies. So it's quite possible that any one entity may receive funding from Department of Homeland Security, Department of Transportation, EPA, or HUD, or HHS, or other agencies that aren't represented on our panel discussion today. And so the question is, well, if you have a complaint, who do you file it with? Right, which I think is a really important question. So you can definitely file your complaint with the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. Our office, my office, in the Federal Coordination and Compliance section, will work to ensure that a complaint that involves multiple funding agencies gets to the right agencies. If you are able to identify the agencies that may have jurisdiction, that may have the responsibility for ensuring Title VI compliance related to the program that you're complaining about, you can file your complaint with one of those agencies or multiple agencies. I think several of us have complaint portals, right, that where you can submit your complaint through our website. And there's also email addresses on our website where you can submit a complaint. But if you believe that there are multiple agencies that should be looking at the matter, I would encourage you to identify that within your complaint, because it will alert any one of us or others that we may have a shared interest in working together to address the concerns that are raised. And we've done this in the past related to complaints that have come in. I know my office has been involved in joint investigations with other agencies in order to address a complaint. So maybe folks on the line might be able to elaborate if there's anything that you would like to add to that, how you might handle a complaint that involves multiple federal agency equities.
Well, Daria, we actually have one right now. We have a complaint that involves us, that involves CRCL and involves FEMA. And so we are coordinating on it and talking about it and trying to determine, the best way to collaborate and proceed. So it isn't necessarily uncommon. I mean, sometimes people write a letter to the director of different offices, and that's one way that it happens. But yeah, we're quite able to take those and get together and determine how to proceed.
I just wanted to add that, if we do receive any Title VI complaint or just discrimination complaint against one of our recipients, one of our first steps is to check for funding from other federal agencies. So that's something that we do every time. That's part of our complaint process, because for DHS, as I mentioned, so often our recipients are receiving funding from another federal agency. So, it would be, it's helpful to us if the complainant can, identify those other agencies, but that is not necessary, because we will, do that research to identify the other federal funders. And in fact, I'm thinking we've done that before with Lillian at EPA. So we, definitely have experience in working with other federal agencies on complaints.
Yeah, absolutely. And as my colleague Lynn knows, even very recently, I mean, we see where we each have complaints, and although they involve slightly different agencies, slightly different recipients, it comes down to the same issue. And so we are working together to make sure that we're leveraging our authority and to get the best resolution possible.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you all. We have a few questions that I think go beyond I won't presume go beyond the expertise of our panel, or at least the information that we have relating to promoting alternative uses to fossil fuels, and dealing with, let's see, the question relates to disproportionately impacted EJ communities, and the impact of fossil-fired power plants on those communities. This was, I think, really to be directed to DHS, because it relates to FEMA's disaster response programs and funding. Amy, I'm not sure if you have any insight on that. I know you had mentioned the compliance review that you all have done related to stockpiles, and so I'll open it up to you to respond to that if you can, or if not, to maybe direct this person to the right office within FEMA.
That's absolutely what I would do. I definitely direct this person to the FEMA Office of Equal Rights. That's our sort of partner civil rights office within FEMA, because they would have sort of the expertise on civil rights considerations in and enforcement activities in FEMA's federally assisted programs. So I definitely direct you, yes, the FEMA Office of Equal Rights, and you can reach out to them by email or a phone, they have a web page, and I can potentially, I don't know if that can be sent out through the chat, but I think I might be able to link it. But yes, I also, just to mention that we do conduct compliance reviews of DHS recipient programs. When we did conduct a compliance review, although so I think unrelated to what the attendee might be asking about, but of recipient programs that perhaps in this case conducted emergency management activities around chemical stockpiles and with those communities. So that's something, those sorts of issues are something that's certainly on our radar. They have clear environmental justice considerations. And so as we're thinking in the future of, entities that we will select for compliance reviews, that's going to be at the top of our minds, right? Those sorts of environmental human health issues are going to be, issues that we'll certainly consider prioritizing in that program.
Thanks, Amy. We also have a question related to really the intersection of Title VI enforcement and the National Environmental Policy Act. And I can't remember which one of our panelists mentioned NEPA. I think it might have been Yvette. But one thing to be clear with everyone who's attending today is that Title VI is a very different statute than the National Environmental Policy Act. Although we know that there are times where our own recipients may have responsibilities to conduct environmental impact analyses under the NEPA statute, they have separate responsibilities to ensure that they comply with Title VI. And so, one does not substitute for the other, right? And I think that it's important to be clear too, that even when our recipients are engaging in activities such as public participation activities, right? Public hearings related to an environmental project, that they must do so in a way that complies with Title VI. So that means that if the project is going to have an impact primarily on a limited English proficient speaking community, that you ensure that that information is available in the languages that that community speaks. So if it means that you have an interpreter at your public hearing meeting, that should happen. If it means that you have residents who are going to be impacted by a project who have tend to work in the evening, that you may provide, or in the daytime, that you may provide a range of opportunities to ensure that they can fully participate. And that's to ensure that the process is available to all and that no one group is denied access to participating in those public events, those public meetings. So to be clear, they're two separate statutes with two separate obligations, and we look forward to being able to provide additional clarity where needed. I know our website, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, has information around Title VI statutory requirements, and so you can also go to that webpage and get information there as well. Let's see.
And Daria, just to add a fine point to that, is the tendency to aggregate communities. So if you aggregate communities, you will not see the LEP community or the community persons with disability or the AAPI community. I think that's a fine point. The Title VI analysis that needs to happen.
Exactly, and I see that we are approaching the end of our session, but your point about aggregating data is really important. And I think Amy mentioned that that you've developed a data collection tool, and I think before we close out, that it's important to highlight that in the administration's effort to address racial inequities and environmental justice issues within communities, that it's really critically important that we have clear data that demonstrates who's being impacted. And that data also allows us to do our job to effectively enforce the various civil rights statutes. And so it's, I think it's important for folks to know that there are current efforts to improve data collection and have disaggregated data so that we can do our jobs more effectively and ensure that the programs that we're funding are reaching the communities that need to be benefiting from those programs the most. All right, so we have, of course, way more questions than we have time to be able to answer today. I do want to thank all of our panelists. I really appreciate the time that you've given to present today and to share what we're doing right now to build up our Title VI enforcement program and address environmental justice issues, to fulfill the mandates of this new administration, the directives of this new administration through its various executive orders. And I think we all look forward to being able to engage with the public more proactively and to increase our outreach and stakeholder engagement going forward. I'd like to thank Melinda as well as Lloyd Moore, who've organized the National Environmental Justice Conference over the years, for continuing to have a panel that is focused on Title VI enforcement. I think it's been so important to ensure that we have a vehicle to connect with the public on what we are doing in the federal family, and for us to also hear directly what concerns are so that we can be more responsive. So with that, thank you. And I think I turn it over to Melinda. I see you pop back up on the screen.
Good morning again. Well, I trust that you enjoyed the panel and that you will leave today's session with a great deal of knowledge from our panelists that you can take back and share with the rest of the federal family. I want to thank Daria and all our panelists, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today. I also want to thank our EJ Conference Board of Directors and our board chairman, Mr. Ben Wilson. Last but not least, we thank Mr. Lloyd Moore, our EJ Conference Coordinator, and Naisha Pushanga, our consultant. Without their efforts and expertise, this session would not have taken place. So I have one last announcement I wanted to share with you. Our next workshop will be coming up in June. It's a NEPA workshop, Visualizing Equity Through NEPA, June 21st, and more information will be coming out on that. I also want to invite you to join us in September for our joint National Environmental Justice Conference and Training Program and the National Health Disparities Conference. More information will be coming out on that. So thank you again for being here, and be safe.